Hey, special educators, I'm Jennifer from Positively Learning. Welcome to the Special Educators Resource Room. If you're like me, you're always looking for ways to save time and streamline your work. That's why this podcast was created, to give you the systems and solutions you need to get your time back. Tune in for tips, tricks, and tools that will help you manage your workload and make the most of your time. Whether you're brand new or experienced, all are welcome in the Special Educators Resource Room. Ugh, I did not want to share this topic for this episode of the podcast. However, it was my reality, and it might be yours too. The topic is all about test prep and what it can look and feel like for our students. Now, I'm going to be sharing a series of test prep steps that we took and had great success with. However, please know, I am not condoning spending our precious time with our students on preparing for an assessment. But it was a requirement, and you might be in the same boat. So what I did is I wanted to approach this as developing a routine, because I knew that's where my students would thrive. And I wanted to provide a series of problem-solving steps that didn't waver. This meant that they could be applied to a variety of problem-solving situations, and the language would stay consistent. So whether my students were preparing for a first grade literacy test or a second grade math assessment, these steps would stay the same. So my goal was to develop a routine for solving a problem from start to finish. Now, I can say with complete confidence, these steps really work. And I promise I'm not bragging. I can say that because I tried everything. And basically, I found all the ways that didn't work. But these steps did rise to the top, and we had great success. I also tested them out by checking in with several general education teachers who all had their favorite content area, and I wanted to see if these steps were really universal, that you could use them whether you're tackling math or comprehension or phonics. So you ready to hear what the steps are? All right, so here are the 5 steps, and if they sound simple, it's because they really are, and that was intentional. All right, the first prompt I gave my students was to read the question blank number of times. And you can fill in the blank because you know your students best. For me, it was often a 2 or 3. Read the question 2 times, read the question 3 times. And when I was modeling, I always did this, never skip a step. The next prompt was where we spent the majority of our time. This prompt is, what is the question asking? This is so important. So we read the question blank number of times, and what is that question asking? If I was modeling this, I would be thinking out loud. I would be looking at the question. Maybe I'd circle the verb for my students to notice. I may provide an example of what the question's asking as well as a non-example and see if my students know which one's which. So here's my example for you. Say that you are displaying for your students to look at a series of shapes, 2-dimensional shapes. And one shape is labeled. Maybe it says, this is a square. So your students are noticing this. You've read the question. Oh, and I should mention about reading the question. Many of my students were not reading independently. So this might be modeling or providing some visual prompt to read the question. All right, so we see the square, and the question or statement says, click on all the shapes that are not squares. All right, I don't know about your students, but my students would see the label of the square, notice the other squares. Most likely, they'd be clicking on all the squares and feeling pretty good about themselves, right? But of course, we know that's not what the question was asking. Now, I will say this is technically a math question. It's all about shapes. But in my opinion, it's more of a language question. So that is what we're practicing with this test prep. All right, so we've read the question. We've determined what the question's asking. Now let's keep going. The next step, number 3, is look at all the answer choices. This probably sounds really familiar because we're all familiar with test taking steps. All right, and then the next one is to select the best answer. And the last is to check your work. And that can look many different ways. Many times for me, it meant going through all of the questions again, making sure we didn't skip anything and we gave it some thought and, we double checked everything. But of course, you may have some other systems for checking your work that your students are familiar with. All right, so now that we have these 5 test prep steps, what do we do with them? I know for me, I wanted my students to feel really confident in their problem-solving routine, knowing it would be there for them in a variety of situations in the classroom and even beyond the classroom. So I wanted to start it as soon as possible and not wait till quote-unquote test season, which yes, can feel all year round, but I technically think it's in the spring. Now, if you're listening to this in the spring, don't worry, but I would start as soon as you can. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention is I don't do this as a separate activity, but instead embed this in everything we do. So I know in our math curriculum, we always had a math application problem. So if I was modeling this, I would model the steps with that math application problem we're already doing on a daily basis. I would provide an anchor chart, an interactive anchor chart, not like a Pinterest or Instagram fancy chart, but instead a piece of chart paper. Maybe I would use different color markers and number each step. As I'm modeling that math application problem, I would keep referring to that chart, using modeling, using think alouds, maybe even checking off each step as you go so students can follow along. I love to give examples like think alouds, but I also love to give non-examples and see if my students can catch it. They just for some reason always thought it was a hoot to see me make a mistake. That's fine with me. I will do that if that is what makes learning stick. Now, if you're doing read alouds, asking and answering comprehension questions, these steps apply. You can use that exact same chart and never skip a step. Check them off as you go. Or skip a step. See if your students notice. I hope so, but if they don't notice, that just gives you more insight on what needs to be practiced. So while I highly recommend embedding this problem-solving routine into everyday learning, there were times that I focused on just giving my students practice with different types of question stems. So this might look like a small group asking a few rapid-fire questions at the beginning. And maybe my students were working collaboratively to answer, going through the steps, or maybe it was even like a game show style where they were going through the steps on their own, writing their answers on whiteboards, and then showing their answer. You could also do this at the end of your time in small group, almost like an exit strategy. This really gave my students an opportunity to become more familiar, and it gave me insight on how they were doing. Remember that squares example? Well, that was real, and I got to see my students miss it because they missed the language that was in that question stem. So that is an idea for them. No, we don't want to spend time focused solely on test prep, but we do want to build our students' confidence in their problem-solving skills. Well, I hope this was very useful for you. What I want to do is share 2 blog posts. You can find these in the show notes, so be sure to click on over. One blog post lists all of the examples and test prep steps. So if you didn't take notes, that's okay. I have the notes for you in this blog post. And I have another blog post that goes through these different steps with some visual examples. So be sure to click on over if this is something that you're facing in your classroom setting. And as always, I appreciate your support and listening. And if you'd like to leave a review, that would help so much to get the word out to other special educators. In the meantime, I'll see you in the next episode of the Special Educators Resource Room. Take care. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'm dying to ask, what'd you think? Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. You can find the show notes and links for everything mentioned in this episode at positivelylearningblog.com. See you next week for more special education solutions.